Mark 3, and we get a storyline here. Most of it is a story, which Mark is very good at doing. And the first thing we have is a man with a withered hand. Again, he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come here." And he said to them, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out immediately and held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. And so we see here we've got a story, and it has a couple of different characters. And the first character is obviously Jesus. And I like to try to look at, since Mark's so good at giving us stories and giving us how the details of how these stories played out, and we have these different characters, I like to see what we can learn from each one. And so Jesus is obviously the center character of the story. He has the power to heal, he has the power to condemn, or he has the power to do nothing and walk away. And we also see the next characters, it's the they of the story, which are the scribes, the Pharisees. These are the people who are witnessing, the audience, and they're probably mostly Pharisees mixed in with the others, but these people were not there to even consider Jesus's actions. They were only looking to find a mistake in him, to find a fault with him, to find some way that they could accuse him of doing evil and breaking the laws. Hopefully, none of us can relate with that part of the story or that character, because we would not be people who are looking to tear down the faith. And I would challenge us to be very careful when we enter into debates and discussions that we walk into, especially inside of the churches, that we go into those humbly, and we go into them aware that we could be the one that's wrong and not necessarily the person we're going into combat with, and that we look to always restore faith in believers and not to tear them down or anything like that. And then, of course, we have the man. The man he's just a pawn in the Pharisees' chess game. He's just the unimportant person who's there that they can manipulate. They're not concerned about him as an individual. They're not concerned at all that he has a handicap with his withered hand. This doesn't even seem to be on their radar. They're more looking at him as he is a way that they could challenge and check and see what Jesus will do. Now, I think we can be represented and find ourselves in the man with the withered hand, because we have no power to fix ourselves. We have no power to heal ourselves. We have to come fully relying on Jesus, and only Jesus can make us well, both physically, but more importantly, spiritually. He's the only person that can do that. And I love in verse 5, where it says, "And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart." Jesus was angry when he saw people watching, that they cared more about their own power and maintaining their own belief system than to help the people who needed it right there. They could not have cared any less about this man. They were only concerned with themselves. And we cannot we cannot let our religion get in the way of us helping other people. We have to remember that we are called to help other people. But that's the second greatest commandment. Love God with all of our heart and love our neighbor as ourselves. And so we can't neglect people. And we saw last week in Mark chapter 2 that Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath. And Jesus told them the Sabbath was not, let me back up. Man was not made for the Sabbath. Instead, Sabbath was made for man. And he asked them, he says, "What is better, that we do good or we do evil?" And I took that, and I'm thinking about this, and I hear Jesus' challenge to me saying, use today to do good. Don't put off doing good till tomorrow. Don't be extremely proud of the good that we did yesterday. Today is the day that God gave us to do good. And so we need to look for ways right now, today, that we can do good things and not think about the future, not think about the past, and don't let either one of those slow us down from today, what we have. And of course, we see at the end here, the Pharisees, they leave and they go find the Herodians. The Herodians were a different branch of the Jewish people at that time that were wanting to establish the throne and the lineage of Herod as the new king over Israel. They weren't necessarily concerned with the Davidic line coming from King David like the Pharisees were. And usually these two would not have agreed, these two groups, but they had a common enemy. The way that they saw it, their common enemy was Jesus. And they were going to find a way to get rid of him, to try to find a way to destroy him by either killing his reputation, or we know ultimately by killing him outright. And I'm going to go right into the next one here. So in the next group of verses, we have Mark chapter 3, verses 7 through 12. And Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the sea, and a great crowd followed him from Galilee and Judea and Jerusalem and Idumea and beyond the Jordan, from around Tyre and Sidon. When the great crowd heard all that he was doing, they came to him. And he told his disciples to have a boat ready for him because of the crowd, lest they crush him. For he had healed many, so that all who had diseases pressed around him to touch him. And whenever an unclean spirit saw him, they fell down before him and cried, "You are the Son of God." And he strictly ordered them not to make him known. And this is very similar to what we saw last week with the huge crowds making it difficult for Jesus to do his ministry. But I want to point out a few things here. Jesus never sought large crowds. He never went to gather a whole lot of people or to send his disciples around the countryside to advertise and to bring people in. Instead, the crowds sought Jesus because he was doing something that was so different. He was doing something so miraculous, that was so God-filled, that people took notice. And they couldn't help but take notice of that. And we actually see Jesus telling people most of the time in the Gospels how hard it is to follow him. And so we know that he's not chasing people down to make them or to ask them or beg them to come follow him. But I want to point out more here in verse 11 and 12, where it says, whenever an unclean spirit saw him, they fell and cried out, "You are the Son of God." And Jesus strictly ordered them not to make him known. And I was wondering about this, and I sat back and I spent a lot of time thinking about this week. And why would Jesus tell the spirits to be quiet? Why would he tell them to silence themselves? And I think I found the answer. I think that the Holy Spirit gave me this answer actually through another pastor. And why did he command them to be silent? Because Jesus didn't want anybody to believe in him through the word of a demon or an evil spirit or a demonic presence. He didn't want Satan to be what people trusted. He didn't want people to ever believe what Satan told them, because Satan he's the master of telling half lies. He's the master deceiver. We saw that in the garden with Adam and Eve. And we need to be very aware and careful around these evil spirits, not to trust them, not to go after them for advice. And we see this here, that Jesus did not need, nor did he want, the affirmation of Satan. He wanted Satan to be silent in his presence. He didn't want Satan to tell the people around him, "This is the Son of God." And we need to be careful to never look or listen to these demonic spirits or these unclean spirits, because they can't be trusted. And see, I think this would have been, if the spirits would have been allowed to speak, then they couldn't be trusted in what they were saying was true, because a demon telling you this is the Son of God would more than likely be trying to lead you astray from that. And I think the Pharisees would have caught on to that too. And they would have said, look, even the demons are trying to convince you, and you can't trust demons. And so Jesus told them, be silent and don't reveal who I am to people. And so we should just be very careful of the spirits that lead us to Jesus. Going on to verses 13 to 21, and he went up on a mountain and called to him those he desired, and they came to him. And he appointed 12, also named the apostles, that they might be with him, and he might send them out to preach and to have authority and to cast out demons. And he appointed the 12, Simon, who he gave the name Peter, James the son of Zebedee, and John the brother of James, to whom he gave the name, and I'm going to probably mess this name up because it's in either Hebrew or Greek, Boanerges, and that is the sons of thunder, Andrew and Philip and Bartholomew, and Matthew and Thomas, and James the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, and Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. And he went home, and a crowd gathered again, so that they could not even eat. And when his family heard it, they went out to seize him, for they were saying, he is out of his mind. Now it would appear that Jesus had a lot more than 12 people following him. It would appear that Jesus probably had his pick of who he wanted because these crowds were so great. And yet in verse 13, we see there, it says, he went up on a mountain and called to him those whom he desired, and they came to him. And I was wondering about that. He only chose 12 disciples, and they were the ones he picked. And it seems that they didn't have a say in it, who he was going to be. So should the other followers, the other people that were there, should they have gotten angry or mad or their feelings hurt and left because Jesus passed them over? And I would say no. And I would say no. And I would say, let's look closely at that list again. If you read those names, there's a name that's not there. Mark, the writer of this gospel, he's not one of the 12 disciples that we're giving there. And most likely Mark learned of Jesus' story later from either Peter or Paul or Barnabas, because he's mentioned in the book of Acts as John Mark. We think this is the same man that wrote the Gospel of Mark, and he's not there as the 12. And this was important to me because, especially verse 13, Jesus chose who he wanted, not who anybody else wanted, not what any other person wanted. He chose the people he desired to have carry out his mission. And we need to be accepting of that. We need to say, yes, Lord, if you picked me, that's great, and I'm going to follow you with all my heart. But God, if you don't pick me, and you pick my neighbor or my friend, or maybe you pick somebody that I don't really get along with that well, yes, Lord, your kingdom be magnified and glorified. Not my kingdom, not me, but choose the people, God, that's going to bring you the most glory. And then we see again, he goes home and another crowd gathers, and the crowd is so big that they can't even have their meal. And Jesus' family is there, so this would be his mom and his brothers, and they are trying to get him out of the spotlight. They start telling people that they're afraid that Jesus has gone crazy. And it makes a lot of sense practically that they would be saying this, because if you think about it, if these huge crowds are gathering to Jesus, then Rome, who is occupying Israel at this time, Rome is going to take notice of that. And when Rome takes notice of these large crowds, they think that it may be a potential rebellion on the verge of happening, and they would come out to squash that. So you have the Romans to contend with, that may be dangerous, that Jesus has to avoid, so his family would be concerned about that. You also, no doubt, you've had the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and now the Herodians. They're all out to get Jesus. And so you have all of these different religious leaders that are plotting to destroy him, and maybe the family has heard about this, and they're concerned, and they're wanting to help save Jesus. And so they're now saying that he's out of his mind, and they're wanting to protect him. And that's where we go into these next few verses. Verse 22, and the scribes who came down from Jerusalem were saying, he is possessed by Beelzebub, and by the prince of demons he cast out demons. And he called to them and said to them in a parable, how can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. And if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but is coming to an end. But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man. Then indeed he may plunder his house. Truly I say to you, all sins will be forgiven the children of man, and whatever blasphemies they utter. But whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit never has forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin, for they were saying, he has an unclean spirit. So we have these scribes. They came down from Jerusalem, and so apparently they were very upset with Jesus. They were looking for a reason to take him down because they'd made the trip from Jerusalem down to Jesus' home. And these scribes had come to declare that Jesus was in the same league as Satan, and that Satan and Jesus were using a common plan to trick the people. They accused that Beelzebub was helping. Maybe either they were working with Satan to trick people, or maybe Beelzebub was trying to overthrow Satan and take over. Either way, Jesus looked at this argument and he found it to be absurd. He told them, he said, he was here to wage war against the power of sin and darkness for the souls of men. He was here to save the souls of men, not to try to trick them or to steal them. And if demonic powers were warring against themselves, then the demonic powers would fall. But Jesus was warring against them, and the scribes were actually helping Satan by attacking Jesus. And we see that Jesus, and we get to verses 28 and 29, where he talks about blaspheming against the Holy Spirit. It's a pretty tricky couple of verses here, and I think I can say that nobody's 100% certain what this means, but I feel like I'm pretty certain, or I'm pretty sure that what we're talking about here when we're saying blasphemy of the Holy Spirit, see, Jesus was using the Spirit of God to cast out demons. The power of God, the Spirit of God was being used to cast demons out, to heal people. And by them rejecting that power that he was using, by the Pharisees and the scribes rejecting the Holy Spirit's power that was apparent in Jesus, then they were also rejecting the power of the Holy Spirit to bring salvation to men's souls. So to change that and say it in another way, if Jesus doesn't have the power to cast demons out of people with the Holy Spirit, then he also can't have the power to save us, to save our souls from eternal damnation. You can't have it both ways. And I think Jesus is issuing a warning to the scribes, telling these men to be very careful not to reject the power that they are dependent on to have in order to have their salvation. And I think that's a very real thing for us as well. And if you notice, he says, if you blaspheme the Holy Spirit, if you say the Holy Spirit doesn't have the power to do things, well, then that Holy Spirit doesn't have the power to save you, and you never have forgiveness, because you're rejecting the power of the Holy Spirit. You're refusing to accept the power of the Holy Spirit as salvation for sins. And we can talk more about that at the end if you guys would like to. And so now we get to Jesus' mother and his brothers. And so all of this is happening in their hometown. And his mother and brothers are already concerned because Rome is looking at Jesus with these huge crowds that are gathering, thinking there may be a potential rebellion to put down. You have the Pharisees that have now partnered up with the Herodians that are looking to take Jesus down. The scribes are there saying that Jesus is using the power of Beelzebub to fight against Satan, and his family is concerned. And so his mothers and brothers came, standing outside. They sent to him and called to him, and a crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, "Your mother and your brothers are outside seeking you." And Jesus answered, "Who are my mother and brothers?" And looking about at those who sat around him, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother." And we see here, this is a hard truth. It's really hard for me because I love my family. Excuse me. I love my wife. I love my two sons. I love my parents. I love my entire large family. I love them all. And Jesus is giving us a hard truth here to show us how our relationships with people change when we are saved. Because when we accept the salvation of Jesus, when we are accepting the adoption as children into God's family, then we go into God's family. We can't be so focused on this world that we let our earthly family relationships tie us down and to cause us to live outside of God's will. We're joining his family. And so Jesus looked around and he rightly assessed that his family were those doing the will of God, those there living in the will of God. And I have to ask, what about us? Are we so focused on God's will and his will alone that we're willing to say, my family are the people who are there doing God's will? Does God give us permission, therefore, to neglect our families and to just let them fend for themselves? I don't think so, because we're told throughout the Bible to care for the orphans, the widows, the poor, the oppressed. And so I don't think, especially if we have older parents, we can't just say, oh, they're not my problem, they're somebody else's problem. I'm going to do God's will. Um, Even think of Jesus when he's dying on the cross. He looked at John the apostle and he said, John, here is your mother. And he was speaking of Mary, his mother, and he said, look after her. And so even Jesus, as he's dying on the cross, perfectly fulfilling the will of God, he cared enough about his mother to ask John to look after her when he was gone. So I don't take these verses to say I can just neglect my family, I can just leave my wife and my kids, and that's not my problem. No, they're very much our problem. When we have those family, it's our responsibility to take care of them. But we need to also realize that we are given a way here to see if we're in God's family. Are you doing God's will by looking around the people that you're surrounded by, and are they doing the same? So I have my wife and my sons. Are they following God's will and following my lead? That's my number one job, is to be a pastor to my family, to teach them and to lead them and shepherd them, and to have my sons grow up and to have them be more bold in the gospel than I am, and to have them go out into the world and proclaim the good news of Christ even more than me, and to do much more than me. And that's my goal. But we're here and we see how important it is to have that family of believers, how important it is to have our church family, and the church not meaning the building, the church being the people that make up that building.